Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CoC Action Agenda webinar, Building a More Responsive, Collaborative, and Action-Oriented Continuum of Care. Today, your presenters are Maura McCauley, the Director of Homeless Prevention, Policy, and Planning from the Chicago Department of Family and Support Services, and myself, Dave Thomas, Vice President of Community Partnerships at All Chicago.
Before we get started, I'll just go over a few housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar and the slides will be sent out after the presentation. We'll take questions and answer at the end of the webinar, but feel free to submit questions using the question chat box throughout the webinar. If you have any audio or visual issues, click the raise hand icon and we have someone here who will help you out as best as possible.
So for the objectives for today's webinar, to go over the purpose of the CoC Action Agenda, which comes from the Chicago Strategy Memo as adopted by the COC Board this past June, and hopefully everyone has had a chance to review the memo ahead of time. The next objective is the CoC Action Agenda and community involvement. We'll talk through what the Action Agenda is and how it will roll out with community input and action. And then lastly, what are the next steps for implementation and what's needed to move from the build-out stage to full implementation of the agenda.
We want to open with an overview of a recent account of the number of households experiencing homelessness right now in Chicago. Our system has made impressive strides and we've worked very hard as a COC, but there is general agreement that we need to do more and we need to do our work differently to ensure that our fellow Chicagoans have the resources to move to safe and stable housing. And this is the reason behind all of the things that we'll talk about today. About a year ago, national consultants from CSH took the COC membership through a series of interviews and community discussions about the COC's strengths, opportunities, threats, and weaknesses. These 4 strategies are the summary of that process. First, the COC needs the flexibility to organize its work in a task-oriented way to achieve the goals of Plan 2.0. Currently, our charter prescribes committees that exist, membership on committees, and rules for things like quorum and voting. Our work is not organized explicitly around the activities needed to end homelessness. Second, as we've learned in many of our recent initiatives, we need dedicated staff to facilitate the work. Scheduling meetings, following work plans, ensuring appropriate representation in discussions, and communicating action steps and progress to the community. Third, we need to ensure that we have a COC board that is focused on and capable of directly aligning resources with activities and needs identified by COC work groups and our data. And finally, we need a strategy to build political will to get that leadership on board with our strategic goals, set targets, and commit to expanding housing inventory. We have not had a targeted housing pipeline in a long time, and it's essential. These strategies were endorsed by the COC board in June, and over a period since June until now, we have been moving into the implementation phase of these strategies or planning for implementation, and we are calling this implementation concept the COC Action Agenda. I want to share what I see as key benefits of this transformation. I hope you will see these as we walk through the major components of the action agenda later on in this webinar. We will improve efficiency by identifying tasks and activities our COC needs to take on and create a work structure around that. Using a shared vision and a roadmap with specific work plans and targets will help us establish a collaborative, transparent, and accountable COC. In this new structure, decision-making authority rests with working groups and committees, and we can avoid delays due to process and rehashing policy decisions. The board's role and responsibility will really change from in-the-weeds operational decisions to approving high-level policies and aligning resources to drive and support the work happening on the ground, especially with housing resources. We're getting a lot of questions about why this is the time to do this. The COC is ever evolving. We have become increasingly sophisticated in the way we do our work, and this is a natural next step for our system, so we can continue to improve on what we're currently achieving. We've been working hard to build political will. The Mayor's Office has endorsed the action agenda, and people who can bring critical housing resources to our COC have agreed to join the board, including CHA and the Mayor's Office. GFSS and the Mayor's Office are also engaging other city departments to join a newly configured board. The flexibility in work structure and the new board role and membership is based off lessons learned from the Ending Veteran Homelessness initiative. EVHI has a leadership team made up of decision makers who are able to make policy and funding decisions that support the on-the-ground work of service providers and veterans. We've reduced veteran homelessness by 30%, and we believe we can scale this up to the whole system. We believe it works. Finally, this process has been going on for a year. There have been many discussions and community interviews that led up to this. It's a decision point for our COC now.
So the structure of the action agenda has 3 key parts to it. First, the most important part being the work groups and committees led by project managers, identified project managers, who will pull together experts from the community and utilize work plans to achieve clear goals for the lines of work or action, which we'll review shortly. The second part is working closely with the work groups and committees will be the lead project managers themselves. The lead project managers will be responsible for weekly meetings with all project managers to support their work, ensure goals are being met, and help them overcome challenges. The weekly meetings will also be used to improve communication between the lines of work and build better collaboration. And then finally, the lead project managers will be responsible for reporting back to the COC Board of Directors as well as the Mayor's Office. The lead project managers will keep the board and Mayor's Office updated on the work plans and ask for help from the board and the Mayor's Office to overcome the challenges identified by the work groups and committees. So, as I mentioned, committees and work groups will be key in driving the work to end homelessness now in our system. The community's voice, their knowledge, and expertise will be influential and help shape policy. So the first part of this is improved communication between all the lines of work as well as the COC Board and Mayor's Office to ensure that all parts of the action agenda are on the same page, a collaborative approach. Your voice and expertise at the table, community leaders and experts will be identified to support and influence areas of work and action. Third part of this is meeting only when necessary to get work done. Currently, almost all COC committees meet monthly, but the action agenda will move from having prescribed times to meet to meeting only to take action. This may look different depending on the work to be accomplished. It may still be an ongoing, this will still be ongoing meetings, but could also be time limited. It could also look like focus groups, one-time meetings based on a topic, or holding community sessions. And then lastly, we're looking to be more nimble and responsive to the changes that happen. So committees and work groups become more action-oriented and have flexibility to adapt to changing needs and emerging issues. So the next 3 slides lay out the 12 lines of work I previously mentioned, where community involvement will be vital. The lines of work are all based on Plan 2.0 and are just a starting point. We anticipate that as the action agenda rolls out, we may need to refine these lines of work by either adding lines of work or ideally have less focus on lines of work that have been completed or accomplished and will not need as much attention. This is where the nimbleness and flexibility of the action agenda will be extremely useful. We'll have a link at the end of the webinar where you can view more complete descriptions of the line of work, but we wanted to give a high-level overview of each. So the first one is communications. And this is about internal communications throughout the COC as well as external communications about the COC's accomplishments to the community at large. The second part is crisis system transition. Is about recognizing the need for a crisis system but fine-tuning it so that individuals and families' episodes of homelessness are as short as possible. Third, the coordinated entry system. Now that the coordinated entry has rolled out, we're beginning to see its impact and the need to continuously improve it. Fourth, performance data and research. This area of work will be a key activity for ensuring that all programs in the system are performing at their best and continue to have a positive impact on reducing the number of homeless in our community. Next, system funding. This will ensure we maintain or grow our HUD funding while identifying system-level needs that require additional funding, either private or public dollars. For pipeline expansion, we'll be using a gaps analysis to project our need for housing units and shift or develop resources to match that need. Employment and income is about helping to build self-sufficiency through employment and mainstream benefits. And the youth line of work is about understanding youth's unique circumstances and their needs to develop an age-appropriate response system. For the veterans line of work, it's about continuing to build off the successes of the Ending Veteran Homeless Initiative and become the largest city to end veteran homelessness. For HMIS, it's about continuing to build out a top-notch data-driven system which can also connect to other systems that impact homelessness. Supporting change is about addressing the current changes and building a system that supports change in the future to remain flexible and nimble. And then lastly, the 12th line is about a street response that addresses the street homeless and their unique needs as well. So to talk about some of the benefits of moving to an action-oriented infrastructure under the action agenda, we wanted to point out some of the benefits and give some examples of issues we've run into currently and that we hope that the new infrastructure will address. So right now, the COC structure is complicated. Committees aren't communicating with each other consistently. Work gets done relatively slowly and in silos, and there aren't enough clear goals and benchmarks. This new structure would change all of that, or a lot of that. Communication, collaboration, and action-oriented work will be built into the infrastructure. As I mentioned previously, groups will meet when there's work to get done. So to the first bullet point, to have less burden for the community members to prep, administer, and facilitate meetings. Currently, service providers, people with lived experience, and other key stakeholders are responsible for setting up meetings, developing agendas, taking minutes, facilitating the meetings, and ensuring the committee roster is filled, and ensuring committee members are COC members, and ensuring quorum and tracking votes. This is an extreme burden on community members. Shifting or eliminating some of these burdensome tasks off of community members and onto All Chicago or DFSS staff who are paid to lead these efforts will give more time back to community members and remove administrative burden. We also see this as being less burden for community members to be the lead communicators between the board and other committees. Currently, the committee chairs are responsible for reporting to the COC board as well as working with other committees when the need arises. Often their roles and responsibilities are unclear and communication often breaks down. Shifting the reporting responsibilities from the committee chairs back to All Chicago and DFSS staff puts the responsibility on us to ensure communication gets to the board as well as to the other committees and work groups when those communications are crucial. And vice versa, All Chicago and DFSS staff would be responsible to ensure communication from the board and the mayor's office gets back to the committees and work groups and the community at large in a timely and transparent manner. The third bullet point, more task-oriented work. Currently, committees and the board get too involved and bogged down in process and theoretical discussions with little or no action taken towards moving the needle on ending homelessness. For example, committees often get tied up on following strict interpretations of the Charter or Robert's Rules of Order, which are important, but those discussions may take up more of the committee's time than actual discussions about ending homelessness. Through CSH's SWOT analysis and from formal and informal discussion with community members, this was a concern identified by most stakeholders as a reason why committee work is so slow to move forward. The committees and work groups within the action agenda will have clear goals and benchmarks, and all meetings will be about developing actions to reach the goals and the benchmarks. This should create a more efficient use of everyone's time and energies towards our collective goal of ending homelessness. Fourth, committee work group structure is less prescribed. The charter currently mandates a set number of voting committee members and where those members should come from. It's a one-size-fits-all approach that has bogged down committees and their ability to accomplish work sometimes. For instance, more time is spent on ensuring the prescribed roster is filled rather than focusing on who the necessary experts are who should be at the table. And having a prescribed set of voting members then forces committees to focus more on administrative tasks such as attendance, meeting quorum, and filling vacancies, rather than keeping focused conversations on our goal of ending homelessness. And then lastly, we see the committee and work groups involvement is based on community members' area of knowledge and expertise. The charter's current mandate of how a committee should be seated does not always allow for the participation from local experts in that area or topic being discussed at hand. Committees' work and decisions are often challenged because the board does not feel the right individuals were making the appropriate decision. The action agenda allows for committees and work groups to be formed without a prescribed set of members and to open up for more of the content area experts to be brought in to help define the actions, take action, and reach the committee's goals and benchmarks. Right now, we'd like to show you an example of how the new structure could look and help resolve some of the issues we've just identified. So this is just one example of how collaboration, along with improved communication and improved responsiveness, can look like. So as the coordinated entry system rolls out, we were already aware of the need for additional units, that we just did not have enough units to house the number of people homeless in our current system. The pipeline expansion line of work will be key in addressing this need, but also as current programs will be evaluated on coordinated entry implementation, we'll need to look at their performance based on data from coordinated entry. Recognizing that coordinated entry is a huge system change, technical assistance and capacity building under supporting change will continue to be a need. And finally, as gaps in the coordinated entry system are identified, beyond the need for additional units, funding for other parts of the coordinated entry system will need a focus and will need to reach out to private funders or seek additional public funding to fill those gaps. All of this need for collaboration will take place within the new structure of the action agenda. So as previously mentioned, the action agenda will depend on experts in the community to shape the policies and the work needed to end homelessness. We are in a process of developing an online system to recruit and identify committee and work group members, and diversity will be vital to that process. And all groups will be open. Work group membership will be based on expertise and knowledge and not a prescribed slate. And we ask you to keep an eye out for more information next month about how to access this online system. We understand that communication will be key to implementation, and here are some ways we plan to have work communicated and increase transparency. We'll be publishing work plans once they're finished on the Action Agenda website, and we'll also email the community. Work plans will be updated via email monthly. Project managers will report work plan progress at board meetings, and then the Action Agenda alert emails about implementation progress will be sent at least monthly as well. So we plan to do a lot of communication around this new structure.
Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the vision for a new COC board configuration. As I alluded to earlier, having a board that is positioned and charged with aligning resources and activities is really critical if we want work groups to make a true impact. The vision for the new board, again, is to transition its role and function from operational and approving policies that work groups should have the authority to approve to a board that aligns resources to drive and support the work happening on the ground, especially housing resources, and holds the vision of achieving the goals of Plan 2.0. The board will approve only high-level, system-wide policies and will be responsible for driving political will to support the work. We are seeking people with decision-making and funding authority from major systems and people who have a system-wide view of ending homelessness. I mentioned the EVHI structure earlier, and I want to give you two concrete examples of how the EVHI leadership team supported the work on the ground to show you how this new board could more strategically operate. Jesse Brown VA Medical Center leadership early on when we started EVHI, and before it was required by the VA, saw a benefit in partnering with the COC on coordinated entry. They made a policy decision to allow their VA staff to directly enter into HMIS, making HMIS the main data platform for our work in Chicago. They also committed to taking 90% of their VASH referrals from the COC's coordinated entry system, or one list as we call it. This partnership ensured that we cast a wider net in reaching veterans throughout the city, and it helps us to prioritize the most vulnerable veterans for specialized VASH resources, regardless of where they enter the system. Another example is that the team on the ground used HMIS to complete a gaps analysis of housing resources for veterans. The data and provider experience and recommendations from their day-to-day work with veterans highlighted that we needed long-term subsidies that are not permanent supportive housing. An SS provider who himself was a veteran took this to the Chicago Housing Authority and the leadership team, and CHA allocated 450 housing choice vouchers to fill that gap. When we talk about resource allocation, we are not only talking about the HUD-NOFA and ranking decisions. The board may prioritize activities and reach out to the funders collaborative that will form under this action agenda, or board members may look within their own scopes of their organizations to align resources. Imagine if we could scale up the type of analysis that we did with EVHI for the whole system and create a board that can look at the entire system as they make resource allocation and funding decisions. So the new board that's being proposed in the recommendations that I'll talk about next would reduce our current board from about 25 to 26 members down to 15 to 18 seats. As I mentioned earlier, we have a commitment from the mayor's office, from DFSS, from the Chicago Housing Authority. We're looking to continue to have 1 to 2 private foundation representatives, a business leader, which is a new seat, a faith-based organization, and then 5 to 8 large representatives from public, city, state, and federal government or academic organizations. Those were intentionally left a little bit more flexible so that we, again, in the interest of flexibility and emerging needs, can change that as the needs of our system evolve. We're continuing to have the important voices of our Service Provider Commission members and LEC members, Lived Experience Commission members, and they will each have 2 members in this current configuration. So in order to move the action agenda forward in alignment with our current charter, some official steps need to be taken. We reviewed the action agenda with the Charter Amendment and Interpretation Committee, and the CAIC Committee will be taking recommendations to the COC Board and then the full continuum of care. Essentially, the recommendations are asking the board to approve a demonstration period to allow for flexibility in the COC charter to test out the action agenda work structure that we just described. It is not asking for a charter amendment. The language is really about giving us flexibility, and then within a year's time, as we see how this works, we can come back to the table and make a charter amendment if we so choose. The second piece will be requesting an amendment to the board composition. So that will be a charter amendment, and it will require a full COC vote in order for that to move forward. The way that the recommendations are framed, again, for both the work structure flexibility and for the board composition amendment, are really focused on flexibility. So the language of the recommendation for the board actually allows us room to change membership as long as we don't go up or down from the minimum and maximum number of board members. So there's a lot of opportunity to make changes even within without a charter amendment going forward, whereas right now we definitely need a charter amendment to make any changes. To give you an idea about what happens next and what are the next steps with the action agenda, I think as many people know, there's a special COC Board of Directors meeting this Thursday on November 30th. On December 7th, the recommendations will be brought to the LCOC meeting where we'll seek approval for this, and the LCOC will vote. You can look for continued communication through action agenda emails. As work plans get developed for the 12 lines of work, we will be sharing with the community via email and on the All Chicago website. Provided this moves forward, we will populate the work groups and committees. As Dave mentioned, you can look for further information about that, and I'm sure it will also be emailed out about how to get involved. And we will focus on a really critical task of developing specific targets for each line of work and for our system that help kind of drill down on the Plan 2.0 very broad goals. And we would also work on solidifying the board composition so that we're ready to do a board transition if that is approved. And before we end, I just wanted to recap how we got here. In 2016, All Chicago engaged, as we've talked about, the national CSH consultants to perform the SWOT analysis. And then throughout spring and early summer, the consultants had several community discussions. They conducted 24 stakeholder interviews. They interviewed All Chicago staff in addition to the community stakeholders. They garnered feedback from an online survey, and they held 2 in-person community discussions. The board affirmed the 4 strategies that came out of all of that work, and a team made up of 17 Chicago COC stakeholders met throughout the summer to provide input on the action agenda structure to the CSH consultants. And from that, that planning, this chart with the 12 lines of action was developed, which the stakeholder team then affirmed. We have been taking the action agenda concept and lines of work and recommendations to the community since September, essentially. Dave and I have visited many committees, commissions. We've met with the board and different stakeholder groups to take feedback and adapt the approach as we move forward. So these recommendations are coming to you after a lot of discussion, after a pretty big community-wide process. So at this point, we will take questions. So the first question is, who determines the project managers?
So the project managers, as part of the original Chicago strategy memo, is about having All Chicago staff and DFSS staff be those project managers. In a very basic way, that's what we get paid to do in our COC system, is to lead some of the All Chicago with the HUD resources and DFSS with the ESG and other city resources. And so it'll be All Chicago and DFSS staff being identified as project managers to lead this implementation effort. But obviously, all we're doing is leading and facilitating these processes, these lines of work, but getting community involvement to sort of guide and direct what kind of work should be done and helping us reach our goals.
Will Robert's Rules of Order no longer be followed, or the charter?
So the charter, one, it's a HUD mandate, so we'll always have a charter governing our COC. What the action agenda is really getting at is asking for more flexibility within the charter. I think when it was developed with really good intent to make sure that as things were evolving from a non-chartered COC to a chartered COC, giving it some direction and some structure to it. And again, as we mentioned earlier, from garnering feedback through this process, a lot of committees and individuals were feeling sort of hamstrung by the strictness of some of the charter guidelines. And so we're asking to open up some of that flexibility, but to be guided by it as well.
The rest of the charter itself will stand. The next question is about what will happen if work plans are not sent out monthly. So I think this is an accountability question, and as essentially the COC board is the managers of accountability, for lack of a better phrase, the board will ask Dave and I essentially what's going on, why are we not getting updates, and things like that. Certainly community members can reach out to us to ask why those things aren't happening, but could also take it to the board if there were serious concerns about communication and transparency. So then the next question is just around, are we looking for a board of influence and affluence? And I mean, I think the short answer is yes. We're looking for a range of things, though. We're looking for important voices from the community through people with lived experience and service providers. And we're also looking for major stakeholders with resources to come to the table and be accountable to helping us and join us in addressing homelessness. So we are looking specifically, the charter amendment language specifically asks that those people have decision-making and resource allocation authority within their organization so that they could, on the spot, make a commitment or go back and quickly pave the way. The next question is, how do we define high-level policies?
I think Maura alluded to this in earlier in the webinar, but the high-level policies are things that affect the entire system and maybe not just one program or one aspect of the COC. It has to be a really far-reaching policy that affects, potentially affects, units, affects funding decisions. So I think they're basically those sort of system-wide impacting kind of policies, and not some of the decisions that could be made at the committee and work group level. Once those groups have flushed out the issue and have addressed it and come up with a decision on how to move forward with those types of things, the only thing they would bring to the board are things that impact the entire community.
So I think a good example comes from the Coordinated Access Steering Committee, and actually the work that CSH is doing with its partners, the lead implementing partners. So for each of the subpopulation rollouts that have happened with coordinated entry, they have continued to meet with different stakeholders to hear what concerns are. And the example I'm going to give is from the youth sector, where they were the first to roll out after veterans, and there were concerns about how people were being prioritized for transitional housing. There's slightly different needs for youth-specific transitional housing, and they weren't sure they were getting the right matches. And so an example there might be that we could test something out with a few providers for some time, and then the group could come back to the table and say, yeah, that seems like it's a better prioritization standard. Let's recommend that that goes into our system-wide priorities. So the board would then affirm or vote on the system-wide priorities, but it would be after a work group or committee had the authority to test some things and try them out and come to basically an agreement that this is how we want to roll it, how we want to move something forward. So the next question is around whether we are proposing a charter amendment, and the board composition is a charter amendment. We cannot change that without a charter amendment. And who is on the action implementation team is the next question.
Again, that's there might be a couple, I'm going to try to answer your question from some different angles here to make sure I'm understanding it. But over the summer, we had community stakeholders, I think Maura mentioned this earlier, where there were board members, there were, including service providers, people with lived experience, we had funders in the room, we had system level agencies like CSH involved, and the CSH consultants were kind of this implementation team that looked at Plan 2.0 and how we were addressing it, or maybe in a lot of cases not really addressing the goals of Plan 2.0, and said, what do we need? What do we need to focus on to kind of move the needle on ending homelessness? And so that team helped to develop, with a lot of CSH's support, national CSH's support, these 12 lines of work. But once the action agenda rolls out, again, the lead project managers would be mostly staff from All Chicago and DFSS, leading and coordinating the work, obviously with community involvement and input to drive the decisions, and just having our staff sort of coordinate all that work together.
Right, we are not the decision makers, we're facilitators. The decision makers are all of you who would be participating in the committees. Right, so the follow-up question to that is that the charter remains the same, except for the one section that we're proposing to amend. So yes and no. The charter remains in place. There would be a change in the board composition officially, and then the recommendation also asks the board to test this period, or to have a demonstration period where we're testing flexibility. So it allows us to do this task-oriented work structure without all of the requirements of a quorum, specific slates, and things like that. Other things like ensuring diverse participation, membership, communications, and expertise would remain the same. Those major tenets of the charter would stay in place. What happens if the COC board votes no? So this is an important question.
So at the board meeting this Thursday, November 30th, what we're asking the board to do is endorse the recommendation from CAIC. If the board itself says no, this will still go to the all COC membership on Thursday, December 7th. It's the membership that gets the ultimate vote. We are bringing it to the board's attention because, again, this is kind of the decisions we want the board to move in, is looking at community-wide, high-level decisions, and so we're asking for their endorsement of this because it's in a lot of ways a very big game changer, and so we want their endorsement. But according to the charter, the ultimate vote lies with the COC membership.
There's some kind of repeat questions that I'm having a hard time following. I think that there's a follow-up question about accountability, and I think the true accountability of the project managers is to the COC. So just like we currently operate, you know, many people are part of stakeholder groups that organize, that have representation on the board, that talk to other board members, and those paths would still be in place. And our expectation is, and the project manager's expectation is that we are held accountable. It's our job to facilitate and help move the work of the continuum forward. So we have an expectation that if we're not doing our jobs, that somebody holds us accountable. So we look forward to that.
And I don't know if this was the intent of the question, but just thinking about accountability on an even higher level, I think what we're trying to do with the action agenda is to take our COC to the next level. We've done a lot of great work already, but ultimately we're accountable to the people still living on the streets and in shelters. And we are trying to drive a new system forward, or a more refined system more than a new system, to be more accountable to those folks that we serve. And that should be our sort of ultimate goal of how we're being accountable. So if we're not reducing the number of homeless, you saw the over 10,000 people still unhoused earlier in the webinar. If we're not driving down that number, we may not be doing our job as a system.
And I think the bigger question on accountability is that the way this new structure is set up is that there's actually more accountability to all of us. There's not one person that has more of a stake in this. The accountability of the board is to bring resources. We're bringing a board together that hasn't been pulled together in this coordinated way in a long time, if ever, here in Chicago. And so their accountability is to all of us as a COC. There's different checks and balances with the representation and how we'll establish the work structure. So there's a question about who gives CAIC the power to bring this to the all-member meeting.
The charter itself mandates a community process and a particular group to take recommendations on charter updates and amendments and edits to the all COC membership.
And then,
and I'm sorry, and CAIC was identified by the COC board in the last 2 years to be that identified group.
And then there's a question about whether has the agenda for the all COC meeting on December 7th been publicized, and do members who will be attending the all COC meeting know they will be required to vote on this initiative?
Yeah, so the agenda, again, according to the charter, should be published or should be posted a week prior to the meeting. So that should be going up by the end of the week. And on there will be the voting items. And we've been doing outreach to make sure that members understand that there are voting items. And actually the last few years, the December all COC meetings have had the voting items. So hopefully people remember that or know that, and we'll look for the agenda and the voting items. And obviously we'll send emails out to everybody who registered to make sure they understand what's happening at this meeting.
There's a question about the number that we shared at the beginning of the webinar and where that came from, and that's actually that's the new dashboard to end homelessness. So that's directly from HMIS.
And you can go on our website, allchicago.org, and under the HMIS tab, there's the only tab that comes down, the only drop down is the Chicago dashboard to end homelessness. And every week that's updated.
There's a question about whether all COC members will be allowed to vote. Absolutely. Anyone who's a registered and paid COC member, unless you have a waiver from paying, will be allowed to vote. One representative from each organization if you are part of an organization. So there's a clarifying question about who can vote. If you're registered as an organization, an organizational member, one person is designated for each organization to vote. So I would just encourage you to be clear within your organization about who will be coming and voting. As part of the outreach that we're doing, we are also just confirming that with organization leadership. If you are an individual and you are a member, then you can vote. Any other questions about the action agenda or the next steps? So, I mean, we're getting a few follow-up questions about voting eligibility, and I would say if you have questions about your eligibility to vote, please call All Chicago, Dave, and he will help kind of work that through. It doesn't appear that we are getting any further questions.
But if you're thinking of other questions, just as we head to our last slide here, we definitely want you to stay informed. Please check out the website for the action agenda. You see the link there, and like we said, we'll email out the PowerPoint so you have direct access to that link. But you can go on All Chicago's website and look for the Continuum of Care tab and the action agenda under that. Definitely, we encourage folks to sign up for those action agenda alerts we mentioned earlier. Again, there's the link. Once we send this out, please click onto that and sign up. And then we encourage you to email us with any other questions, comments, or concerns. Maura and Dave here, and you see our email addresses there. So please reach out to us if you have questions after the webinar ends.
So we've been talking about a lot of potential changes, some of which I think when you look back at the SWOT analysis and the community feedback around concerns about process and rules and governance, give us the opportunity to try something. We're asking to work as a community to test a new way of doing things that hopefully will lead to action and bring housing resources to our fellow Chicagoans who really need them. I understand that it can be nerve-wracking. There's a lot of possibilities when we think about what if this is the wrong decision, but I think, in closing, I'm asking you to think about what are the possibilities if this does work and this does achieve the desired goals. I think there's some exciting possibilities. We are committed as the lead project managers to continue talking and engaging about how this moves forward if the COC decides to move this forward. So thank you for your time and all of your questions. We'll see many of you at the COC board meeting, and then hope to see you and your organizations, if you're part of an organization, at the All COC meeting.